Someone didn't just poison the Mafia boss. They turned his own body into the weapon. This attack was designed to look natural, feel invisible, and kill him from the inside while everyone around him panicked in the wrong direction. The doctors are scared. His men are blinded by fear, but the one person calm enough to see the pattern is an outsider with nothing to lose. And the second she figures it out, she becomes the next problem they have to deal with.
The surgeon didn't exit because the work was done. He fled because he'd run out of miracles. High above the frozen Chicago streets, inside a penthouse built of blood money, Santino Castellano's life was leaking out. This wasn't a mechanical breakdown. His soul had simply issued a final order to stop. 15 medical gods, whose signatures cost millions, stood frozen like panicked students at a crash site. Helena Cross, the woman who'd snatched presidents from the grave, looked lost at the clinical glare. Beside her, Rajan Mehta stared at the heart monitors, as if trying to decipher the ruins of a dead civilization. Beyond the glass, 400 soldiers waited in the shadows, knowing that if their king fell, the skyline would ignite. Killian Castellano, a man who only spoke in the language of gunpowder, issued a soft, lethal command. "You have exactly 8 minutes. My brother poured $60 million into this theater, and another $15 million to keep you vultures on a leash. If his heart stops, you're exiting through the windows, not the doors." But the king's salvation didn't come from a syringe or a supercomputer. It didn't wear a white coat. It came with Jolene Hadley, a 27-year-old single mother drowning in debt. She reached the top at 2 a.m, hauling crates of prime cuts for a kitchen staff who had no idea their criminal empire was currently being decapitated. A $500 tip was the only prayer left on her cracked phone screen. Down in her rusted truck, 4-year-old Rosie slept with a ragged bear named Mr. Boots. Jolene was a ghost in this palace of gold, yet near the dying man, she caught a whiff of something the $1 million filters ignored, a stench the doctors couldn't define. She knew that odor. It was the damp decay of her father's South Side basement before he disappeared. This wasn't a body failing, it was an execution in progress. And the person who pulled the trigger was still breathing the filtered air of the suite. If this descent into the darkness has you hooked, smash that like button and join our circle. Send this to someone who loves the macabre and hit subscribe now. You don't want to be left in the dark when the next scene unfolds. In that sky-high tomb, the most dangerous man in the city was drifting into the abyss. The only thing tethering him to the earth was a woman the elite treated as invisible. Beneath her feet, the cold stone caught the monitor's blue glow, turning the bedroom into a quiet waiting room for the dead. Heavy velvet curtains choked out the city lights, sealing the room away from the living. The sharp sting of surgical alcohol fought against the thick weight of expensive cologne, creating a scene where every breath tasted of old money and fresh rot. Santo remained a statue of gray flesh, his eyelids sealed tight, but his left hand was beginning a terrifying dance. His digits weren't just shaking, they were moving in a haunting, rhythmic pattern, as if his nerves were playing a funeral song on an invisible piano. Dismissing the hand's movement as a death rattle, Dr. Cross reached for a 15-centimeter needle. It was a final, desperate act of violence meant to pierce the chest and force the muscle back into a rhythmic beat. This was the final curtain, the ultimate strike. It would either bring him back or nail his coffin shut. Just as she prepared to drive the steel home, Maida grabbed her wrist. His voice was heavy with the weight of a man who understood the heart's secret lies. "Look at his hand, Helena. That's not an oxygen-starved brain misfiring. It's a perfect 3-second cycle. The heart isn't the problem. The mind is actively murdering the body, ordering it to give up the ghost." Cross snapped back that the blood work was spotless. No poison, no foul play. With only 2 minutes on the clock, time became a physical pressure in the room. Meta asked if it was right to jumpstart a heart when the soul was screaming for the exit. You aren't saving him. You're just committing a desecration. He'll die because of our ego, and that failure will haunt us forever." A heavy silence filled the suite. 13 world-class doctors watched the standoff while the King of the Shadows slipped further into the bog. In this family, a medical mistake didn't lead to a lawsuit, but a shallow grave. Watching from the edge, Dr. Silas Marchetti stood like a stone gargoyle. He said nothing, merely leaning against the wall and wiping a strange, oily sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. This wasn't the sweat of a nervous man. It was the fever of a killer watching his timer count down. Silas knew exactly when the bomb would go off, but the room was too fixated on the needle to see the wolf hiding in plain sight. Every eye was locked on the silver point and the steady tap, tap, tap of Santo's fingers. The clock hit 2:17 in the morning. Down in the industrial kitchen, a delivery girl was about to step into a bloodbath. Killian was finished with the debate. He pulled his phone and growled a command that froze the air. Lock down the top 10 floors, kill anyone who shouldn't be here, and let no one in. His word was the only law that mattered in this tower. Below them, 400 soldiers slammed the bolts home. The elevators died, and the stairwells were chained shut. The skyscraper turned into a 70-story steel tomb. Every soul inside was now a hostage to Killian's spiraling insanity. He put his phone away and stared at his brother's ghost white face and that rhythmic finger tap. Killian saw a pattern the doctors missed, a haunting echo of a nightmare he'd survived once before. His thoughts drifted back 17 years to a silent white hospital room. Killian was 16, a boy already hardened by blood, sitting by his mother, Margarita. A rival's cruelty had turned her into a transparent shadow of a woman. Arsenic in a vintage red had been her end. Served at a dinner full of lies. By the time they knew, her organs were already folding. He could still smell the funeral lilies and the sterile plastic of the oxygen tent. He remembered the long, electronic shriek of the heart monitor and how his own voice broke. Then Santo arrived, 19 years old and carved out of cold stone. No crying, no rage. Just a brother walking into the wreckage of their lives. Santo had pulled him into a grip so tight it felt like their souls were being welded together. He whispered 3 words into Killian's ear: "Never again." That promise became the cornerstone of their bloody kingdom. Months later, the family that killed their mother simply ceased to exist. No graves, no traces. Now, watching the rhythm of Santo's fingers, Killian knew the nightmare had come home. The oath was broken, and the ghosts were back for their pound of flesh. Killian gripped his gold pistol until the metal groaned. Someone was going to die before the sun came up. He just hadn't picked the target yet. "Easy, Killian," a voice drifted from the dark, cold as a winter tomb. Jude Thorne didn't walk into the room. He just let the shadows release him. At 62, the syndicate's oldest advisor was a ghost you could live with for years and never see until he chose to be seen. By the time you heard his voice, your chance of survival was already 0. Dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, he leaned on a black cane with a silver head. That cane wasn't for walking. It hid a 30-centimeter blade, a guarantee that Jude always had the final word. His freezing eyes swept from the brothers to the dying man, then over the 15 shaking doctors like a wolf watching sheep. Guarding the door was Declan Voss, a mountain of a man. At 45, he carried the scars of missions the government had erased from history. Declan didn't wear suits for style. He was a walking hurricane of violence that made men's skin crawl. His eyes never stopped moving, scanning the room every 2 seconds, a lethal habit born from hunting bombs in the ruins of Fallujah. He ignored the medical talk, focusing only on hands and shadows. It was 2:20 in the morning. Santo lay still as Cross held the needle, ready for the killing stroke. Meanwhile, behind the service doors, a pair of hidden eyes watched the whole play. Those eyes belonged to a woman who had just found a scent she'd been trying to bury for years. 30 minutes before the world ended, Jolene Hadley sat in her beat-up truck, her face lit by the cold blue light of her phone. A notification bled onto the phone screen. An order for 3 prime steaks and aged wine destined for the 67th floor. $500 hung in the balance, a windfall that meant 3 grueling shifts or the bridge to a 90-day overdue rent bill. Her thumb hovered over the glass, eyes stinging with fatigue. This was the price of a roof, the cost of keeping little Rosie tucked into a shared bed, while the shadow of the bailiff loomed at their door. Jolene's gaze drifted to the back of the truck, where her daughter was a small knot of warmth beneath a tattered, threadbare blanket. The girl's small fingers were locked around Mr. Boots, a mangled teddy bear shedding its stuffing. 1:30 in the morning was no time for a 4-year-old to be living out of a delivery vehicle, but $15 an hour for a sitter was a ransom the South Side couldn't pay. It wasn't a decision, it was a slow-motion wreck. She accepted the job with a trembling tap, checking the rearview mirror to ensure the child hadn't stirred. Her life was a relentless loop of culinary prep, scrubbing floors until 10, and steering into the dark until the road blurred. She was a machine, powered by nothing but sheer, bone-deep depletion. Peace was a luxury Jolene would never settle, her nights offering barely 4 hours of mercy. Every dawn, she plunged her swollen knuckles into scalding water for 10 minutes just to force the joints to move. Though only 27, her silhouette was etched with the weariness of a 70-year-old, a living record of every blow she'd ever taken. Her frame carried old fractures, the legacy of Derek Hadley rather than some random tragedy. He was an officer of the law who found his solace in whiskey, turning his rage on her while she was 7 months heavy with child. In that house, a single stray crumb on a dinner plate was enough to summon a storm of violence. She'd curled into a ball on the cold kitchen floor, taking every strike to protect the life kicking beneath her ribs. A silent vow written in bruises, that promise led her through the gray walls of shelters to a cramped studio. Derek, ever the predator, never bothered to track the prey he'd already broken. Freedom finally came at 3 a.m. on Interstate 90 when his car became a tangled coffin of steel and glass. The police called it a mechanical failure, but Jolene felt no triumph. There was only a vast, empty stillness where a sense of closure should have been. Yet the scars Derek left were shallow compared to the void left by Raymond Hadley. Her father had dissolved into the air years ago, leaving behind a house that felt like a tomb and a basement workspace, so bleached it seemed as though he had been erased from history himself. The official search for him died after 21 days, and soon the rhythmic pulse of his phone line went flat. She carried a jagged suspicion that he hadn't been taken. He'd simply looked at his damaged daughter and decided the debt was too heavy to carry. Believing he'd simply walked away was the only way to avoid imagining darker ends. Now, her rusted truck idled before the Shastayano Tower, a 67-story spire of obsidian and glass that cut through the midnight sky like a jagged surgical blade. Clinging to her sleeping daughter with one arm while hoisting the heavy crates with the other, she crossed the silent marble foyer. The elevator hummed, a pressurized lift toward the heavens. When the doors slid open, she faced a man who loomed over the room like a granite sentinel. Declan Voss stood there, a portrait of icy aggression. He barked an order to drop the delivery and show her palms, his voice vibrating with the cold authority of a man who dealt in violence. Jolene did as she was told, pulling Rosie tighter into her protective shadow. He sifted through the food with the cold precision of a border guard before shooing her toward the kitchen. As the latch clicked, a faint, ghostly aroma began to seep through the ventilation, tugging at a long-buried fragment of her past. The air was thick with a familiar phantom. Jolene laid Rosie onto a small sofa, covering her with a light shawl and her tattered bear. Every breath she took was a silent plea for her child to stay lost in dreams, hidden from the wolves in this gold-lined prison. Rising, she was hit by the scent again, a haunting echo leaking through the doorframe. It smelled of lavender, but beneath the flowers was a sharp, synthetic sting and a copper aftertaste that only someone with her specific tragic history would ever notice. While the guards ignored the air, Jolene watched through a crack in the door as Santo's fingers twitched in a desperate, rhythmic dance. Inside, the high-priced doctors were trapped in a useless argument until Killian's voice cut through the room like a blade. She tuned out their posturing, her eyes fixed on the silk pillowcase, the source of the scent she was mentally stripping bare. When she saw the condensation on the cold mint tea, the entire tragic script of the murder finally snapped into focus. The combination of the tea and the treated fabric acted as a bridge across 15 years. The luxury suite vanished, and she was once again a shadow in her father's basement on the south side, surrounded by the remnants of his secret alchemical world. A 12-year-old Jolene sat perched on a tall stool in that underground workshop. Raymond's laboratory wasn't modern. It was a dark, medieval study filled with dried herbs and journals that felt like the heavy, sacred remains of a forgotten science. He'd held out 2 small bottles, asking her to identify the soul of the scent. "Lavender," she'd whispered. He gave a mournful smile, handing her the second. "Lavender again?" she asked. "No," he replied. "This is lavender hiding a predator. Grayanotoxin pulled from the heart of the rhododendron." He taught her that while the smells were identical twins, the toxin carried a ghost-like bitterness, a faint hint of burnt almonds on the tongue. A computer might need 40 minutes to solve the riddle, but a human soul knows the truth in 2 seconds. She couldn't understand why anyone would weaponize beauty. Raymond's eyes were dark with unspoken omens. He warned her that a true artist of the kill doesn't use what you fear, they poison what you love. Your own senses are the last wall against a world built on lies. Now, 15 years later, Jolene felt her fingers begin to tremble. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The silk on that mattress had been soaked in a synthetic grayanotoxin, a molecular phantom born from honey that no standard medical test was designed to see. On its own, it was just a whisper of dizziness, a harmless ghost. But the tea on the nightstand was undoubtedly laced with cesium chloride in a dose so small it was invisible. Separately, they were nothing. Together, they launched a violent coup against the vagus nerve, the master switch of the human heart. When that nerve is choked, it sends a final, quiet command to the heart. Stop. The heart wasn't sick. It was being coaxed into a willing death. The surgeons were failing because they were looking for a disease, blinded to the dark poetry of the assassination. This was a cold-blooded execution dressed up as a natural failure. Through this gap, she saw Dr. Cross preparing a shot of adrenaline. If that stimulant entered his veins, it would clash with the chemical veil, causing a fatal explosion inside his chest instead of a recovery. His heart would effectively self-destruct. In their frantic rush to save him, they were about to pull the final trigger for the assassin. Jolene looked at Rosie, whose soft, even breathing was the only light in this room, full of looming shadows and death. Stepping into that stage meant becoming a permanent player in a very lethal game. To these men, she was just a delivery girl in a stained shirt. One wrong word, and neither she nor her daughter would ever leave this tower of glass alive. Yet remaining silent was the same as signing his death warrant. She would be stalked by his memory just as she was by her father and her own life of fear. She refused to let her own terror serve as the final executioner. With one last glance at Rosie, she kicked open the door and shouted that the adrenaline would end his life within 30 seconds. Her voice was a sharp blade, cutting through the sterile drama of the room and forcing every eye to lock onto her. The collection of geniuses stood paralyzed. Dr. Cross held the needle in midair while Killian and Voss stared at the intruder. They saw a woman hollowed out by life, her clothes stained and her eyes burning with the intensity of someone emerging from a fever dream. "You are supervising an execution," she repeated, her tone as steady as a rod of cold steel. A heavy, suffocating silence followed until Dr. Rajan broke it with a mocking sneer, asking if the food delivery girl had suddenly become a medical authority. Jolene didn't flinch, keeping her eyes on the man holding the syringe. She pointed at the bed, explaining that the scent of lavender was the delivery vehicle for a poison engineered to slip right past their expensive sensors. She laid out the details of the synthetic grayanotoxin, a ghost from the heart of the hive that their computers weren't programmed to detect. The laughter in the room vanished, replaced by the chilling realization that this girl was speaking the dialect of a master scientist. She shifted her focus to the tea, identifying it as the secondary agent. Cesium chloride kept just below the level of detection. On its own, it was a shadow. Combined with the pillow, it was a certain death sentence. She explained how the breath and the drink formed a lethal pact to hijack the vagus nerve, forcing it to send a final command to the heart. She gestured toward the doctor's shaking hand and the needle that was about to end everything. "His heart is not failing," she corrected, her voice a cold blade cutting through their panic. "It is being commanded to cease." She cautioned that a single drop of adrenaline would spark a total vascular collapse, transforming their desperate rescue into a flawless, untraceable funeral. The infirmary submerged into a tomb-like stillness, broken only by the electronic pulse of the heart monitors. Dr. Cross hesitated, her gaze flickering between the girl and the liquid, drowning in a tide of pure instinctual dread. Jolene's plea was a jagged whisper demanding she examine his dilated pupils, ignore the widening pupils, and watch the rhythmic tremor of the iris, a ghostly shudder that serves as the unique signature of this lab-grown venom. If I am wrong, let the syringe be his final rest. If I am right, stop the execution. Cross looked for a sign in Meta's stone-carved face, but the giant stood as a silent pillar of oppressive consent. In this cold, clinical order, the silence of a god is a command. Cross drew near Santo's body like a pilgrim approaching a sacrificial altar, lifting the lid to reveal the truth beneath. A broken, guttural sound escaped her. The noise of a human soul witnessing either a miracle or its own damnation. The iris remained dead to the light, trapped in a haunting 3-second spasm that mimicked the twitching of a fresh corpse. A sharp breath hissed from the doctor as she turned toward the mystery woman. She who had saved kings now stood shaking like a frightened child, her voice a soft murmur of sudden, terrifying vindication. The syringe of adrenaline descended slowly as her professional mask shattered into pure horror. Meta stepped into the glare, his skin turning the color of ash as the gravity of their mistake took hold. 15 of the world's most brilliant minds stood frozen, haunted by the fact that they had nearly slaughtered the man they were meant to shield. Cloaked in the dark, Dr. Silas Marchetti felt a sudden marrow-deep frost. His face grew as pale as a sun-bleached skull, the expression of a man seeing the grim reaper in the corner. While Jolene stared at the flickering life, old Jude Thorne remained a silent ghost, his ancient eyes recording every fragment of the tragedy. Before the air could settle, the freezing weight of a gold-etched 9mm pressed against her skull. Killian Castellano's voice did not rise. It was a lethal, low-frequency vibration that rattled her very bones. It sounded like a razor already drawing blood. He leaned in, his whisper demanding to know where she found such forbidden secrets. Killian closed the distance, his eyes sharpening into two jagged pieces of black glass. Jolene felt her pulse hammering against the cold metal, a frantic rhythm she feared he could feel through the steel. Still, she did not flinch. Trapped against the frozen brick and the shadow of a killer, the time for running had passed. "Raymond Hadley was my father," she said, her voice trembling for a heartbeat before hardening into steel. She had long ago traded fear for the cold machinery of staying alive. He was a shadow, a chemist for the elite of the abyss, spending 25 years washing away the blood that the powerful could never take to a clinic. He disappeared 4 years ago, leaving nothing but a ghost behind. From the shadows, the rhythmic click-clack of a black cane signaled Jude Thorne's approach. He moved with a dark, theatrical grace, leaning over the machines to study her with eyes that had spent 40 years stripping the lies from desperate souls. "Raymond Hadley," Jude whispered, tasting the name like a forgotten sin. He remembered him, a brilliant, ghostly designer of the unseen, a phantom who vanished 4 summers ago and stayed among the graves. He gave Killian a weary sign to lower the weapon, but the cold steel remained pressed against her brow. Killian's focus darted between the woman, the old man, and his dying brother. When he looked back at Jolene, his eyes held the freezing logic of a wolf counting a debt. He warned her, as the gun dug into her skin, that if she failed, the mercy of death would be a luxury he would never allow her to taste. "I will start with your daughter while you watch." In that moment, the earth stopped turning. The chirping of the heart monitor and the doctor's breath vanished into a vacuum. That monstrous threat hung in the air, sharp and bitter like the smell of spent gunpowder in a room without windows. With a slow, ghostly motion, Jolene turned, letting the barrel slide across her temple until she was looking directly into the dark eye of the gun. It rested exactly between her eyebrows. When she spoke, the sound was like a transmission from the void. Hollow, ancient, and completely stripped of human fear. This was the voice of a woman shattered and rebuilt by necessity. She was a survivor who owned nothing but the small child dreaming in the next room. "My daughter is 4 years old. She is in your kitchen right now, clutching a one-eyed bear called Mr. Boots because I cannot afford a new one." Her voice sank into a terrifyingly low, resonant tone. "If you touch my child, I will watch your brother die and feel only peace. I will walk over your body and your 400 men take my daughter and vanish. Then you can tell the kings of Detroit why your brother is carrion because you scared off his only hope." Killian watched her, and for the first time in a life built on violence and ash, something inside him shifted. It was not fear, he did not know that word, but recognition. He saw a mirror of his own dark soul, the monstrous, absolute devotion one feels for the blood they would die to protect. He remembered 17 years ago, his brother holding him on a blood-stained floor, promising they would survive. He saw that same primal fire in this broken woman. With a sharp, metallic click, Killian lowered the gun. "Tell me what you need," he said, his voice sounding like the cracking of deep ice. Jolene finally pulled air into her lungs, a jagged breath 2 minutes in the making. I need that kitchen for 7 minutes, and I want my daughter brought here, away from that car, right now. She walked into the penthouse kitchen, where the massive wealth briefly threatened to crush her senses. The room was a temple of polished steel and stone that made her whole apartment look like a closet. The refrigerators stood like monoliths, flanked by granite slabs as thick as a man's chest. This was a stage for masters, not for a woman with shaking hands holding the future of a dynasty in her grip. She had no time for a breakdown. Declan Voss walked in, carrying young Rosie with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man with such a bloody past. He set the sleeping girl down as if she were made of thin crystal. Jolene was momentarily stunned by the sight of a killer showing such mercy to a sleeping child. She pressed a desperate kiss to her daughter's forehead before her mind shifted into a cold, medical gear. She called Bryn Sawyer, her last friend, a nurse who picked up on the second ring at 2:30 in the morning. Bryn, get to the tower. Rosie is here, and I need you to protect her. Just come. The clock was ticking. Jolene searched the fridge for the ingredients of her father's lost alchemy. She grabbed 6 eggs and separated the whites with the skill of a veteran. 6 translucent pools of protein sat in the bowl. The yolks were tossed aside like memories of a life she no longer had. Ignoring the water, she went for the high-end filter, tearing it apart with a raw, desperate power. She wasn't looking for liquid, but for the black heart of the machine. She smashed the casing and pulled out the block of activated carbon, the only thing on Earth capable of killing the poison. She grabbed a heavy mortar and started crushing the charcoal. Each strike was a rhythmic, frantic beat as sweat began to burn her eyes. Dr. Cross watched from the doorway, her medical curiosity finally stronger than her shock. She asked softly why she didn't just use the blender. Jolene didn't stop. She explained that the heat from the blades would melt the pores of the carbon, making it useless. This charcoal's power depends on its microscopic surface area. Fusing those pores shut would turn it into worthless black mud. It was the answer of a scientist, cold, clinical, and final. Dr. Cross stayed quiet, finally seeing the true depth of the woman before her. Jolene reached for a $300 jar of honey, a luxury she could never give her own child. She added 2 large scoops to the egg whites, followed by a steady pour of the finest olive oil. As she mixed the sludge, she spoke out loud, using chemical formulas to steady her shattered nerves. She wasn't teaching the doctor. She was reciting the liturgy of her father's work to make sure she didn't fail. She whispered that the poison worked like a closed circuit. This toxin rides on the blood's fats, cycling through the gut and hitting the nerves over and over. That is why his heart fails in waves. He isn't just poisoned. He's trapped in a fatal biological loop. She mixed in the black powder. Cross stared at the sludge, then at the girl, wondering where she came from. Charcoal seizes the venom mid-transit. Egg whites form a protein shield against the rot, while honey cools the internal furnace. The oil acts as a silent engine, driving the cure to the point of failure. She stared at the black slurry, the final thread tethering a dying king to this earth. That inquiry acted as a ghost, dragging Jolene 13 years back into the sepia-toned past. The biting scent of sulfur and ozone from her father's workshop filled her senses. She recalled the amber flicker of a lone filament and the hollow rattle of Raymond's laughter as he filmed her lessons on an ancient, grain-streaked camcorder. Within her memory, a 14-year-old Jolene stood beside her father, decoding the jagged language of acids and bases. Raymond Hadley hadn't merely shared chemistry. He was forging her into a weapon for a brutal future, one where the thin line between breath and the grave was built from the shadows he left behind. Even a simple lesson carried the weight of a mountain. He spoke in a low, resonant vibration, a grounding tone reminding her that chemistry is just a recipe with life or death consequences. In this laboratory, one mistake invites total darkness, while a single success pulls a miracle from the empty void. He promised her quiet life would one day be her fortress. 10 years ago, a teenage Jolene had laughed, holding a box of baking soda. Today, she is a prisoner in a tyrant's glass cage, her vision blurred by the salt of her own desperation. The last embers of hope had turned to ash. She watched the thick obsidian sludge coat the glass, a dark ink meant to line the stomach. "It is finished," she whispered, stepping into a room where master surgeons flinched as if she carried a ticking bomb. Maida barred the way, mocking the girl who thought kitchen scraps could rival a god. His pride shattered when the heavy bolt slid home. Killian Castellano drew his steel, his eyes two frozen pits. "The delivery girl is the head of surgery now," he growled. "Fail, and I will decorate the walls with your remains," he hissed. The medic recoiled. Jolene moved toward the dying man as another doctor forced a tube down his throat with a cold, mechanical cruelty that froze the very air. Her voice cut through the thick tension like a blade. "Burn that pillow! The poison is still radiating from it." She cast aside the stained violet silk, bracing his head on a medical block before drawing the black liquid into a heavy syringe. With a hand that refused to shake, she depressed the plunger, her heart racing against the frantic pace of her mind. Doubt was a coffin. Terror, the blade. The sludge entered Santo's blood. 60 seconds ticked by as the monitor began its final rhythmic surrender. The doctors stood like statues in a graveyard, staring at the jagged green light. 2 minutes passed. A shiver carved its way through her bones. She had staked her daughter's life on a dead man's kitchen trick, betting their souls on homemade sorcery. Loss meant never touching her child again. 3 minutes of suffocating silence followed, punctuated only by the sterile electronic chirping of the pumps. Killian stood over his brother, a dark shadow in a world that had forgotten how to turn. Pain was etched into his jaw. Dropping his weapon, he took Santo's hand with the raw agony of a lost child. It was a ghost of 17 years prior, clutching their mother's hand in a dim hallway before the light vanished forever. Dr. Cross searched her for a sign of weakness, finding only a mask of ice. 5 minutes. Then the pressure shifted. A sudden pulse, a surge of heat, forced a gasp from the nurse as the lines on the screen found a steady, walking rhythm. It was as if a dying flame had finally been shielded from the storm. A heavy heartbeat returned. Meta leaned in, eyes scanning the vitals and the patient. The violent tremors died away, replaced by a deep calm beneath Killian's shaking fingers. By the 6-minute mark, the heart found its soul again. The digital waves rose with a fresh, violent strength. The gray pallor of Santo's skin began to melt away, like morning frost retreating from a coastline under the heat of a rising sun. Jude Thorne ignored the machinery, focusing entirely on the girl. Beneath his iron mask, a flicker of true shock appeared, a rare break in 40 years of absolute control. 7 minutes in, and the pulse of life was holding the shadows back. 62 beats every 60 seconds. Pressure at 90/60. Faint, but holding. The surgeon checked his eyes. The shaking had stopped. He looked at Jolene with a haunting reverence that would follow her through every dark street she ever crossed. The room offered only a heavy silence as a tribute. Suddenly, Santo's eyelids twitched. They were exhausted but burned with a returning fire. He scanned the white room, looking past the experts and his family until his focus locked onto the stranger in the dark. He stared at the broken girl in the stained uniform, her hair messy and skin marked by hard labor. Amidst the clean white coats, she was a charcoal mark on fresh canvas. "Who?" he breathed, his voice sounding like stone on stone. "Who are you?" he demanded. Jolene stood there, trembling after fighting death with nothing but pantry items. This king of the abyss spoke with the cold arrogance of a man who only asks a name before deciding if it should exist. "Just the help," she shot back. "Your dinner is cold and you still owe me for the mess." Santo Castellano, a man whose whisper could end a city, let out a dry, rattling laugh, a sound so rare it felt like a miracle. Killian was frozen. A smile from his brother was a ghost from a forgotten life. As Jolene turned to leave, the ruined silk caught her eye. Something in the fabric sparked a deep, primal memory, pulling her back into a maze of ghosts. As the heat at the moment faded, she saw the detail the masters missed. She gripped the edge of the lavender silk. There, stitched into the pattern, were two small letters, P and C. She knew the heart behind that needle. Years of sweat in Chinatown had taught her to distinguish a machine's work from a human soul. Someone had marked this cloth. The weight of those initials sent a killing frost through her. She was sinking into a world far darker than she feared. 72 hours later, she was back on the floor, scrubbing the life from her skin. Carmine, her boss, treated her like a plague victim, demanding overtime for a minor spill. Every bone in her body ached with a hollow, ghostly exhaustion. She bore the weight in absolute silence. In her world, quiet was the only currency of safety. She tried to bury the memory of the penthouse like a fever dream, hoping the shadow of the golden gun had finally stayed in the past. She tried to erase those two letters, P and C, knowing that memory was a key to the monster's cage. She wanted a pencil in Rosie's hand, not a trigger. But some skeletons are too heavy to remain hidden in the dirt. The scream of a high-power engine tore through the afternoon air. Jolene kept her gaze down, waiting for another customer. But the heavy, rhythmic strike of expensive leather on the stone told her the devil had come to collect. Declan Boss stood over her, his silhouette blotting out the sun. He was a pillar of fine wool and hidden violence. "This is not a request," his eyes burned. "The master wants an audience," he said, his voice as heavy as a hammer. Jolene stood up, her joints popping under the stress. "No," she said with a finality that shocked her. Declan didn't argue. He simply stepped to the curb and opened the door of a black behemoth, waiting for her to bend to the inevitable. The view through the window sent a wave of pure horror through her. There was Rosie, sitting on ivory leather like a tiny queen, smeared in green gelato and holding her doll. She glowed with a joy that suggested she'd found heaven. Beside her sat a tub of artisan ice cream, a $200 luxury Jolene could never buy. A deadening numbness took hold. This wasn't a kidnapping, it was a show of total power. They had simply fed her sweets and locked her in a $1 million coffin. That casualness was the true nightmare, a silent promise that her child was never out of reach. Jolene felt the crushing weight of her own smallness. The girl waved, talking about the driver's candy, while Jolene wore a hollow mask to protect her from the dark. She held the child with a suffocating tightness before stepping into the silent car. No words were exchanged with Declan. 40 minutes later, they crossed the iron gates of the Castellano fortress, a stone beast that defied the light. The home held 30 rooms and 5 acres of calculated chaos. Hidden eyes watched every step across the green fields. Seeing the trees, the 4-year-old gave a cry of wonder. the sound of a girl who had only known the gray walls of a concrete cage. The office was vault of dark wood and heavy silence. There sat Santo Castellano, a king ruling from the dark. Though his skin held the pale ghost of the poison, his sharp eyes had found their predatory hunger, a look capable of flaying a soul. Standing by the unmoving figure of Jude Thorne, Santo gave a single, ice-cold order to sit. Jolene collapsed, her body throbbing from 4 hours of hard labor, as he gave his terms with the absolute weight of a god who does not believe in no. The offer sat heavy in the shadows. $50,000 a month, a gated fortress, and the keys to an empire. To Jolene, this was more than wealth. It was the rebirth of her humanity. It promised a night of stillness over 4 hours of exhaustion, yet she initially recoiled from the devil's velvet trap. Her defiance was a final, gasping plea to stay clean of his bloody history. But Santo didn't see a person. He saw a chess piece in his terminal game. The moment she read those 2 letters, PC, the script of her life was already written, a tragedy she could not escape. He poked at her motherly instincts with the cold precision of a surgeon. He tore down her defenses, showing her that her flimsy home was no shield against his ghosts. Jolene stood frozen, realizing her own poverty was the very chain he used to bind her spirit. Through the glass, Rosie was a splash of color against the manor's gray, clinical soul. It was a bitter, twisted joke that the man who built her nightmares was the same one buying her daughter's safety. The cycle of the streets was being broken by a hand stained in red. Stepping into the mouth of the beast, Jolene tried to negotiate the price of her own chains. Santo watched with a lethal grin, the way a king might watch a peasant beg for rain. In the Castellano world, such talk usually ended in a shallow grave, yet she stood her ground. She offered up her mind to find her father, Raymond Hadley, a man lost to the fog 4 years ago. It was a swap of one ghost for another. After a 10-second silence that stretched like a hanging rope, his counsel nodded, and the blood pact was sealed in the dark. Their bond was written in survival and blood, heavier than any paper signed in a courtroom. In this golden cage, the price of safety was her peace of mind. That first week, Jolene only found 3 hours of rest, haunted by the debt she owed for her daughter's life. Despite the $40,000 silk mattress, she couldn't find peace in the quiet. She missed the broken music of the South Side, the screams of sirens, and the heavy throb of bass. Here, the silence wasn't a comfort. It was a cold, heavy cloth pressing against her face. The manor was so deathly still, it made Rosie's soft breathing sound like a storm. The child was finally wrapped in a world of fine silk. Jolene looked at the gold and marble with the stranger's eyes, unable to bridge the gap between this palace and the gutter. Watching Rosie thrive in this world broke Jolene's heart in two. As the girl learned the names of exotic flowers, the mother felt the rot of a moral debt growing inside her. Every time her daughter smiled, Jolene felt the weight of the blood money used to buy it. Santo watched them through the unblinking glass of his cameras, a digital ghost in their home. In the deep night, he saw a kind of love he had never known, a woman guarding her child with a quiet, terrifying strength that began to crack his stone heart. He tracked the rhythm of her hands as she prepared a bottle of milk, listening to the tired songs she sang to the dark. In just 2 minutes, her voice brought a peace that he had spent a bloody lifetime trying to buy with fear and steel. Seeing such soft mercy threw his world out of focus. His own life was a map of scars and the cold weight of a gun. To see a woman singing at 10 in the evening, giving everything for nothing in return, shook the very earth beneath his feet. This look into a real soul left the predator pacing his room like a caged animal. On the 8th night, Jolene's mind turned to the hunt. While the house slept, she opened her battered laptop, turning a piece of junk into a weapon of cold, digital precision. The old machine wheezed, but it was the only edge she had. After 3 years of learning to code out of pure hunger, she had turned herself into a ghost in the wires. She wasn't looking for a hand to hold. She was looking for a throat to cut. She moved through the data streams like a ghost at the machine. A single crack in the Manor's obsidian security let her slip inside. This wasn't about the money. It was a mother's surgical hunt through the basement of an empire's darkest lies. Deep in the digital vaults, she found a picture that stopped her heart. A man trapped in a white, sterile hell. It was a shadow of the father she knew, his hair turned to snow, and his wrist bolted to the machines of his own slow death. The lab was a nightmare she recognized instantly. It was Raymond Hadley, her father, caught in a photo from only 3 weeks ago. The sight turned her blood to ice, and she had to count to 10 just to keep her legs from giving out. She walked into Santo's study like a ghost seeking blood, finding him sitting in the dim light with his drink. The air in the room was electric. The girl from the streets had finally cornered the king in his own high castle. She spat the truth at him, accusing him of hiding her father's heartbeat. Santo didn't blink. He just confirmed the nightmare. Raymond Hadley was a prisoner of the Ferraro family, buried in a hole in Gary, Indiana, 4 years after he was taken. Cristiano Ferraro was milking her father's brain to build a plague. He was making the very poisons that almost put Santo in the ground last week. Santo had known for 90 days, but a mole in his house made any rescue a suicide mission. The weight of it nearly crushed her. Her father hadn't left. He had been stolen. For 4 years, she had hated a ghost based on a lie. She had told Rosie stories of a man who ran away while he was actually living through a waking death. He had spent 4 years in chains, his genius harvested to create death. Her voice cracked with the holy rage as she looked from his glass of 60-year-old whiskey to the memory of her father's chains. This gap between luxury and suffering was a sin beyond words. Santo claimed his silence was the only thing keeping her breathing. He knew if she found out, she would go on a suicide run. To him, she was a piece on the board he couldn't lose, but she refused to let his games define her tragedy. She stepped into his space, seeing the one thing he couldn't hide, his own fear. To call a man like him a coward was to ask for death, but the air simply froze. Her words hung there, sharp and cold, and for once he didn't strike back. He lunged forward, grabbing her wrist with a grip like iron. There was no pain, only the electric heat of 2 souls colliding. In that second, the boss's mask fell away, showing a raw, bleeding humanity that terrified him as much as it pulled him in. A spark of something real passed between them before he pulled away as if scorched. He faded back into the dark, his hand shaking with a war inside himself. He told her to sleep, promising that when the sun rose, the hunt for her father would begin. She stood there long after he left, her skin still humming from his touch. Back at her desk, she finally let the ink flow, writing the 2 letters that had started this fire. P.C. Those initials were the key to a much darker house. For 40 years, Phoebe Castellano was a ghost in her own family, erased by the men in power. As the child born in the dark, she lived on the edge of a throne she was never allowed to touch. She saw the blood money, but never a seat at the table. When the crown went to Santo, Phoebe became invisible by choice. She hid inside the ledgers, moving billions with a quiet hand that made her the family's ghost. She was a shadow in the vault, untouchable because she was unseen. Jolene became a shadow, haunting Phoebe for 72 hours. Every Wednesday at 2, a black car would slip away under the pretense of a simple audit. It was a rhythmic ghost dance through the city's darkest veins, a pattern written in betrayal. That Wednesday, Jolene lied to Rosie about an errand and followed the Mercedes into the heart of the city. There was no business meeting. Instead, Phoebe entered a gallery where the paintings cost more than a life, a playground for those who rule from the shadows. From a block away, through a pane of glass, Jolene saw the kiss of death. Phoebe was whispering to a woman in blood-red silk, Gianna Ferraro, the daughter of the man holding Jolene's father captive. Gianna's smile was as cold and hard as a diamond. The evidence of the knife in the back was caught in the glow of Jolene's screen. It was the ultimate sin. Phoebe was selling her brother's head to the Ferraros. In return, they would pave her path to the throne with Santo's cold body. Those stitched initials were a deliberate taunt, a mark of Phoebe's cold genius. She wanted her signature on the weapon of destruction. Meanwhile, in the shadows, Killian tore the confession from Silas Marchetti, a doctor whose integrity had shattered the moment the darkness looked back. Technology was irrelevant to Killian. He spoke the ancient language of shadows and heavy steel. Every soul finds its voice when frozen iron tastes their skin. The truth was foul. $250,000 had flowed from a Ferraro front into Silas's pockets over 6 months. The physician's weapon wasn't a blade, but a calculated silence, brewing tea for peace while unlatching the door for the predator. He didn't strike. He merely welcomed the infection. In the quiet of midnight, Jolene plunged back into the flickering spirits of a 4-year-old digital grave. It was a golden memory preserved in the amber glow of her father's workshop. Raymond's steady hand mentored his 13-year-old apprentice through the labyrinth of science. When the chemicals turned a vivid sapphire, the shared pulse of their triumph echoed in a way Jolene still felt today. "My girl is a natural," Raymond whispered, a ghostly echo of a stolen life. Jolene paused the video, her tears a quiet sacrament for the dead. She contrasted that radiant image with the skeletal wreck found in the leaked files, having long ago designed the internal walls of her wordless misery. The wood grain moaned under the weight of a child. Little Rosie lingered at the threshold, clutching a one-eyed bear called Mr. Boots. "Mommy, does it hurt?" she whispered. Jolene tried to mask the grief, but the girl's eyes cut straight through the facade of her motherly strength. "I am fine, sweetie." But Rosie sensed the phantom pain of the broken. She crawled into the sheets, pressing the toy against Jolene's ribs, vowing that Mr. Boots would carry the burden of her sorrow. As the child drifted off, Jolene finally let a jagged, primal cry shatter the midnight air. From the hall's velvet shadows, Santa stood as still as a tombstone. He was transfixed by the girl's grace, witnessing the heavy gravity of a mother's love through a sliver of light. In that frozen heartbeat, the hunter vanished. He was simply a boy watching his own mother again. Margarita had held him in that same embrace before the toxins took her. Her soft promises were now just fading echoes in a hollow graveyard. He slipped back into the dark, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his hands tight enough to crush the very ghosts he ran from. As Jolene collapsed into a jagged, empty sorrow, the sound filled the hollow house. In the corridor, Santo Castellano stood paralyzed. He had been passing when the wood creaked, and through the glow he saw the bear, the salt, and the shattered reflection of his own stolen youth. It was a mirror of how Margarita once cradled him before the venom's slow kiss. She had hummed songs of devotion, but that tune was a spirit he could no longer recall. He vanished into the home's dark corners, hands becoming ivory stones as he fought the suffocating weight of the night. A ghostly exit left only a steaming cup and a cryptic vow on her desk. "We will find." Yet as she moved through the server's digital catacombs, the heat of the drink vanished. A new bone-deep frost took root, a relentless winter settling into the very core of her being. Her online world was no longer a hidden vault. For 7 days, a specter had recorded every keystroke and every buried sin. The path ended at Jude Thorne, a man whose 40 years of service made him part of Foundation. Was he a protector or just a more elegant jailer? At 6 in the morning, the library felt like a cold tomb. Jude sat with the patience of a mountain, his cane a silent witness, while gray steam rose from his porcelain. He didn't blink when she entered. He had been tracking the rhythm of her heart since she first stirred. "You have been stalking me," she hissed, her body trembling with a caged rage. She struggled for control even as her jaw locked tight. "For 7 days, you watched my father's torture and Phoebe's lies, yet you did nothing but observe the collapse of my world." Jude took a slow, measured sip, his eyes a vault for 3 generations of blood. "My loyalty is to Santo," he countered, his voice as cold as a frozen sea. "I wasn't guarding him from your choices, Jolene. I was shielding him from the explosion of your own reckless grief. A lone raid into Gary, Indiana, would have been your suicide. Ferraro would have executed your father the moment you touched the fence. You would have been buried with your proof." The urge to strike him was raw, but the surgical truth of his words gutted her spirit. "Then show me where your heart truly lies," she demanded in a low growl. After 5 seconds of heavy silence, Jude pulled a folded map from his pocket. He offered it like a peace treaty. It held the coordinates for Industrial Way, the rotting heart of the Ferraro Empire. 4 guards outside, 2 in the hall, and 3 floors down to the lab. Your father's at the bottom. She took the paper with shaking hands. "Why now?" "Because Santo waits until the moment passes. He would leave your father in hell for another day. But you have reached your breaking point, and tonight that fire is our best weapon." Finding Killian was simple. After 10, he was a permanent fixture at the range, spitting lead until the ghost of his brother faded and the shaking in his fingers finally stopped. She laid out the map of lies, Silas, the Ferraros, and her father's cage, keeping only the memory of Santo's skin to herself. Killian slammed a fresh magazine home, his voice a sharp command. "When?" By 3, they reached a skeletal frame in Gary, a cathedral of rusted iron. To a stranger, it looked like just another corpse of the industry. But Jolene saw the electronic predators, cameras hidden in the streetlights and high-tech lungs on the roof. It was a high-security fortress disguised as a graveyard of mid-century steel. Killian moved with the lethal grace of a man born for the noose. The guards dropped like dead leaves, their cries cut short in their throats. As they stepped into the subterranean dark of the stairs, the air turned thick with the heavy chemical rot of industrial poisons. On the bottom floor, the smell hit her, a twisted echo of her father's old lab, now spoiled and foul. There sat Raymond Hadley, a ghost of a man who had lost 40 pounds of his soul. He was chained to a desk that served as both his workbench and his coffin. His hair had faded to a sharp, wintry white, and his skin was a map of deep scars and bone. A silver scar of trauma ran down his arm. When he finally looked up, the warmth was gone, replaced by a fatigue so deep he thought she was just another dream. "This is a tomb for the living," he croaked, his voice like the grinding of rusted gears. Jolene fell to her knees, staring at the cold steel and the 20 years of aging carved into him over 4 summers. She finally let out the scream she had held for 1,460 days. "I thought you would have let me fade away by now." Raymond's eyes fluttered as salty tears carved paths through his exhaustion. "The Ferraros wanted their poisons. When I said no, they ground 3 of my fingers into white dust. He held up a hand of fused, gnarled bone. Then they showed me pictures of you and the girl on South Ashland. It was work or your funerals. I chose the chains. I made their venom, but I poisoned every batch with hidden flaws, dancing on the edge of betrayal until they finally smelled my treason. She held him, but he spoke a name that turned her blood to ice. Derek, he whispered. You sent him for me, didn't you? Jolene went stone still. He found me, but he kicked a nest of vipers. He dug up secrets the Ferraro bloodline would burn the world to keep hidden. They murdered him. That wreck on Interstate 90 was no accident. It was a hit. The truth was a crushing blow. Her own desperate search had signed Derek's death warrant. She wanted to weep for her child's father, but the massive scale of the lie left her hollow. On that cold concrete floor, her world broke into a million sharp pieces. Suddenly, a high-pitched wail cut through the shadows. The alarm. Blood-red lights flooded the hallway in a crimson wash, a violent sign that their stolen reunion was officially over. 120 seconds until we are overrun! Killian's voice rips through the air like a gunshot. Jolene tears the steel restraints away, hoisting her father's withered frame. Despite his physical ruin, Raymond claws at the terminal, wrenching a drive from its slot. Take this, he wheezes, his lungs rattling. The formulas, the payouts, the ledger of every Ferraro puppet is within. My final insurance, should I never breathe free air again. Killian steps from the gloom, a bloom of deep crimson weeping through his shoulder. A bullet has claimed its territory, yet his stance remains immovable. He fires twice into the darkness, rewarded by the heavy, wet collision of a body striking the floor. Go! Killian's order strikes with the force of a thunderclap. Jolene drags her father toward the sliver of light, his trembling weight leaning into her as they starve for oxygen. Behind them, Killian stands as a hemorrhaging monolith of defiance, his muzzle tracking the shadows as he paints the stairs with a red signature of his own life. They burst into the biting frost of the night, the ghostly echoes of ballistics still hammering at their skulls. Killian steers with a single desperate hand, his other crushing the wound in his ruined shoulder while the sirens wail. In the back, Raymond's grip becomes a vice around Jolene's hand, a whispered confession of Santo's absolute reach falling from his lips. Whether the poison originated with Declan, Jude, or some digital ghost was a mystery. Yet, as she crosses the threshold at 5 a.m, the stench of gunpowder and rot clinging to her skin, Santo stands waiting in the hall, a granite statue of silent, crushing judgment. His eyes perform a cold autopsy. A broken father, a bleeding brother, and the woman who dared to play God. The silence is a physical weight. Jolene prepares for the impact, realizing she treated the most dangerous mind in the Midwest as a mere pawn. In this dark world, such vanity is usually rewarded with a shallow grave. Santo remains in a state of terrifying stillness. He takes the drive with a surgeon's precision, his cold metallic eyes drilling into her soul for an eternal minute. A quiet demand for the truth follows, followed by sharp commands to stitch the wounded and shelter the survivor in the manor's deepest heart. Violence remains a whispered threat rather than an act. Yet Jolene feels the invisible line where the living world ends and the cemetery begins. For 48 hours, the house feels like a tomb, while Santo and Jude hold counsel behind heavy oak. Declan stands as a wall of cold iron, a barrier no past intimacy can breach. When he finally emerges, Santo carries a map of vengeance that reaches Jolene only in jagged, terrifying sparks. Phoebe has set the stage, A summit of lethal stakes at the estate that very evening, summoning 7 kings of the underworld from Chicago to New York, including the wolf Cristiano Ferraro. To the world, the meeting is a trial for a failing king. To Phoebe, it is her coronation, a calculated theft of the throne fueled by Ferraro's power. Santo traces every trap on the board, but instead of hiding, he invites the hurricane to make landfall at 7 o'clock that evening. The Great Hall is reborn as a temple of shadow and sin. Around a 20-seat oak altar, white candles weep waxy tears onto the wood, while red wine shimmers like fresh blood. Above, the light falls like a funeral shroud over 7 masters of chaos, each framed by a wall of silent, breathing executioners. Occupying the void of Santo's chair is Cristiano Ferraro, 50 years old, with hair like polished silver and a frozen smile. Beside the ghost of the throne stands Phoebe, cloaked in the black of a mourning widow, her poise hiding a hunger for power that has rotted her for 40 years. The weakness in Santo's hand is undeniable. As the intellect of this family, I move that. Her ambition chokes as the massive doors swing wide. The rhythmic strike of heels against wood echoes like nails being driven into a casket. Santo Castellano appears, armored in a 3-piece suit, the personification of a vengeful god. Though his skin carries the pallor of the grave, his posture is as sharp as a razor, his gray eyes scanning the room with a reaper's calm. Jude Thorne follows, his cane tapping out a metronome of dread, while Declan Voss walks behind with a hand resting on hidden, lethal steel. The mask of Phoebe's calm shatters into glass. A tremor sends a single drop of wine onto the table like a fresh surgical cut. Cristiano's smirk vanishes, a silent admission that his gamble was premature. Santo, he says with a stiff nod, your presence today was an uncalculated factor. Assumptions are simply the blueprints for a disaster, Santo observes, taking his seat with the slow, predatory grace. He locks his gaze onto Cristiano, making it clear that his silence was never a surrender. He then makes a slow gesture toward the shadows of the upper gallery. Jolene steps from the velvet dark of the balcony. To her left is Raymond, a skeletal ghost of a man whose internal flame survived 4 years of burial. To her right, Killian looms, his shoulder wrapped in blood-soaked cloth, radiating an aura of heavy, impending doom. A gold-plated pistol hangs in Killian's hand, its muzzle pointed at the floor. In the silence, Jolene touches the interface, and the 4 screens meant for Phoebe's glory roar to life. Instead of a crowning, they play a digital record of her absolute betrayal. The first screen uncovers the treason. $2 million moved to offshore accounts linked to Ferraro, validated by her own signature. The second monitor flickers on, showing grainy footage of Raymond Hadley, a captive spirit manufacturing death inside a hidden tomb. His hollow eyes seem to tear through the screen to haunt his captors. The third display breaks down the molecular rot of the poison filled with Raymond's secret notes of defiance. Finally, the fourth screen shows the $250,000 paid to a doctor to slowly dissolve Santo's lungs. Lies! Phoebe screams, her voice sounding like breaking china. A plot to destroy me, Santo! The air turns to ice. In her panic, she has dropped his title, a slip of the tongue that exposes the intimate rot she shared with the man who wanted her brother dead. That break in protocol hangs in the air like a tightening rope. Cristiano Ferraro remains as still as a statue, yet for the first time in 50 years, a single bead of sweat rolls down his temple. In their world, that tiny leak carries the weight of 1,000 death warrants. Santo stands, his footsteps echoing like the tolling of a funeral bell as he walks the perimeter of the table. He stops behind Phoebe, his voice falling to a terrifyingly soft whisper. In the language of the Castellanos, a gentle word is a far more permanent sentence than a scream of rage. You forgot that this chair sits upon a foundation of traitorous bones. Instantly, the room falls into a manufactured eclipse. The darkness is absolute, broken only by the clinical, rhythmic cough of suppressed gunfire. Killian's men, moving with the instinct of wolves, navigate the blackness. When the lights return 10 seconds later, Ferraro's guards are pinned in plastic restraints. Cristiano sits like a monument made of ash. Phoebe is a broken heap on the floor, her dress torn and her hands bound, her long-held dream replaced by a raw mask of terror. 7 kings sit in a tomb of silence, realizing this was no mere power play, but a final judgment. Santo's eyes drift toward the gallery, acknowledging his silent jury, Jolene, Raymond, and Killian. The blue light of the tablet illuminates the woman who tore his world apart. With a slight bow of his head, Santo offers a heavy, silent confession, a ghost of thanks. Suddenly, the device in Jolene's hand pulses like a failing heart. 4 words from Bryn turn her blood to ice. Rosie is burning up. A hospital. The grand theater of power vanishes in a heartbeat. Jolene drops the tablet, flying down the stairs and ghosting past the wreckage of Phoebe and Cristiano. She cuts a path through the tactical heat and the ocean of killers, moved by a single haunting fire. She throws herself into her rusted truck, a jagged scar among the silver luxury, and tears away from the estate. No one stops her. They perhaps see the ancient, terrifying power of a mother whose child is standing on the edge of the void. Stroger Hospital rises like a cold fortress under the 10 o'clock lights. Jolene races through the halls, her skin still marked by the filth of a secret lab. She looks like a soldier coming home from a war, seeking cover within a temple of white tile and silence. Outside room 412, Bryn stands, a cold cup of coffee shaking in her hands. Just an infection, she whispers to kill the fear. She is steady now, but she called for you until her little voice simply disappeared into the air. Stepping inside, Jolene sees Rosie looking impossibly small against the sterile white sheets. Her skin is a hot flush, her chest moving with the heavy work of sickness. Tucked among the tubes and wires is Mr. Boots, the last silent guard of her innocence. Jolene moves like a ghost toward the bed, terrified of breaking the silence. But the girl's eyes open slightly, her soul recognizing its anchor. That soft mama is a thin thread of sound. Jolene pulls her into her arms, her own scent becoming the child's only safe harbor. She sat, pinned by the gravity of her own history. She traced the lines of her palms, now cupping her child's head. Hands that once distilled cures from dust and bled into code. The same hands that hauled her father from a warehouse inferno. These fingers had dismantled empires and stifled massacres in the shadows. Now they were surrendered to the agonizing, quiet task of cooling a child's brow. Perhaps their true calling wasn't the spilling of blood, but this profound, tender ministry of mercy. 40 minutes passed before Raymond appeared, wearing a borrowed suit and 4 years of trauma. He froze at the door, watching his daughter and the babe. Those eyes, once petrified by pain and cold chemistry, finally cracked and washed over. The child looked up, locking into the ghost in the doorway. Clutching her toy, she sought her mother's silent nod before whispering, "Are you Grandpa?" In that instant, the man's iron walls shattered like glass beneath the weight of a 4-year silence. He sobbed, a jagged, empty sound from a 58-year-old who'd sold his soul for their safety. An old photograph proved he'd lived on in their hearts. Jolene reached out, pulling the broken man toward the bed to let his spirit finally rest. With the gravity of a high priestess, the girl offered her ragged rabbit, a holy relic of comfort to the weeping man. 3 generations huddled on that narrow mattress, the grandfather's scarred arm forming a living barricade against the closing night. For the first time in 4 years, the world's foundation felt solid. As midnight neared, Jolene's gravelly voice wove a broken hymn for the exhausted. Raymond sat paralyzed, eyes shut, drinking in the song like a parched traveler finding a desert spring. A specter haunted the sterile hallway beyond the glass. Santo Castellano stood alone, stripped of his army, just a shadow in wool braving the cold. He watched the scene of domestic healing, the mother's pulse and the patriarch's quiet return. He watched their closeness with the hollow ache of an outcast at a feast. By 19, his mother was a ghost, and his father had branded love a fatal mistake. No one had ever whispered a melody to him in the choking dark. That 30-room tomb was a monument to power, never a home. He turned to leave, but the door groaned. Jolene stood there, her clothes stained with the day's soot, her eyes sharpened by fatigue. She asked if he meant to stand guard until dawn. Santa's eyes drifted toward the sleeping child and the old man. Breaking his 36-year-old armor, he confessed he didn't know how to exist inside that room. Jolene's reply was a soft grace, suggesting his silent vigil was more than enough. He stepped inside, sinking into a plastic chair that felt stranger than a throne. In the hush, the fevered child stirred, her small hand finding his. It was a raw search for warmth, led by a soul unaware of the blood on his hands. The girl whispered a sleepy comment about his massive hands. Santa looked at palms that had traded lives and snuffed out futures. Now they were anchored by 5 tiny fingers that felt no trace of the violence woven into his skin. He sat motionless. The king of the shadows was held captive by a toddler's grip until daybreak. 2 weeks later, at the Lake Forest estate, the sun bled a bruised violet across the horizon, as if the sky itself mourned the day. In the garden, Rosie was a blur of mud and joy, teasing her grandfather's clumsy attempts to plant mint. Raymond let out a bright, forgotten laugh, the sound of a rusted engine turning over. Coated in dirt, he finally faced the light. Using hands scarred by his captors, Raymond buried the herbs in the soil. He kept a secret, that this very plant was the first lesson he'd taught his daughter 20 years ago. Some legacies are better whispered to the wind than spoken aloud. From the balcony, Jolene swirled a glass of deep red wine, watching the green. She sipped slowly, wondering why this harvest tasted so different from the bile of her youth. Here, even the air felt like a luxury she hadn't earned. Santa appeared beside her, his whiskey glowing like dying embers. He watched her like a sailor eyeing the North Star, desperate to memorize the moment. The silence between them held the heavy weight of 2 survivors from the same wreck. Santo admitted that a quiet life felt like a dead language. In his world, weakness was a death sentence. But under the fading light, he let his mask crack just a fraction of an inch. Jolene kept her eyes on the garden. She remembered years of drowning in exhaustion and her battered truck. With weary honesty, she noted that peace was a luxury they were never quite rich enough to buy. A deep stillness took hold, broken only by a child hunting a worm. That pure joy felt like a blade against their scarred spirits. Santo looked at her, his predatory mask finally dissolving into something human. In this scene, there was no king. Only a 36-year-old man denied his mother's song. He stood there, reaching for a bridge he couldn't build. He spoke one word, stay. Not as a command, but as a raw, trembling plea. Jolene met his eyes, her voice steady. She asked if this was an order or a human request. Santo stayed silent, watching a leaf fall to her feet as the quiet groaned under the weight of his own fear. Finally, his walls collapsed like shadows at sunset. The iron gates of his soul creaked open, releasing a confession hidden for a lifetime. For the first time, he admitted to an undeniable need for another human soul. Jolene said nothing, letting her wine go cold as she reached for him. Her hands were rough, worn by the road. These same hands which once stirred hope in a kitchen pot now traced the scars of a fallen titan. Under Chicago's shifting light, two broken worlds met on a bench. The wind carried a child's laughter. Jolene hadn't come with power or the keys to his kingdom. She brought no status to his dark world. She simply arrived in a rusted truck with cold food and a child holding a broken doll. She mended the cracks that no specialist could find, succeeding because she spoke the language of the broken who still believe in miracles. Her gift wasn't just survival, it was the bravery to thrive. The true magic wasn't in a bottle, but in a man starved for touch and a woman who knew only betrayal, both deciding to bet on hope once more. We see that history isn't always written by the strong. It is crafted by the unseen. The tired mother who, despite her own exhaustion, still finds the breath for a song to soothe a parched soul. Real power lives in the spirit that refuses to break. If this story of fire and healing moved you, please show your support and share this tale with those you love. Join our circle so we can explore these depths together. I want to know which moment shifted your world. Share your thoughts below. A story only truly lives when it is breathed between two hearts. I wish you health, clarity, and peace on the road ahead. Thank you for walking through the dark with me. Sleep well. I will see you in our next story.